I would like to welcome you all here at this event, which is a second event of the roundtables that are organized by the Higher Education Research Group of the CEU. And the aim of these roundtables is to discuss reforms in Central and Eastern Europe, which are taking place in these years, and bring different major changes in the governance and financing and quality assurance and so on. Last time we were talking about Hungary and situation in Hungary. Today we are pleased to hear some news about the Romanian reform, which I'm lucky to study in my dissertation, so I may be even more curious than most of you to see how far it went after I finished my fieldwork. I think there has been many interesting things which were designed in the reform, so we will see how this went on 2 years after the approval of the law, new law on education. And we can hear this from a person who I believe, after interviewing 50 people in Romania, I think I can say that I'm pretty convinced that Professor Vlasceanu is one of the persons who can tell you a lot about higher education since very early times, because he has been involved in this area for many, many years. He's currently head of the sociology department in the University of Bucharest. He's a vice president of the Romanian National Council of University Research. He's also a member of the Council of Romanian Agency for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, ARACIS, and president. He was part actually of the presidential commission which prepared the current reform, which has been approved in 2011. Before that, he worked as a deputy director in the UNESCO Europe Center for Higher Education, which was situated in Bucharest. He was also vice rector of the University of Bucharest, and he also served in the government, so he knows also the government side, not only to say how things should be done, but how it is maybe sometimes more difficult to put them in practice. He is graduated from Bucharest University, earning his first degree in philosophy. Then he completed his PhD in sociology in the London University Institute of Education. So we will proceed as usual. We'll start with the lecture by Professor Vlasceanu, which should take around 40 minutes or so. I will try to maybe make some signs because I know you have a lot to say. But then I would like to give the floor to discussion, because I can see we have a big participation today, and I'm sure that many people will have a lot of questions to follow up. And I would just like to excuse myself that I'm sitting in maybe not very appropriate position, but I just had a small knee surgery last week, so I need a little position like this, so I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Renata. Your positioning is very interesting to me, because I watch the reform in Romania backwards nowadays. So I feel like being at home nowadays. Those familiar with the history of the Bologna process may remember that Claude Allègre, then Minister of Education and Research in France, during Jospin government, play a key role in launching the Bologna process. In fact, he brought the ministers of the largest countries in Europe together, and then the process started, arriving today at including a huge number of countries within the European higher education area. He then published a little book called À quoi sert la matière grise? What counts as gray matter? It refers to brain, of course. He tells a story since the beginning of the 1960s, when he was, before 1968. He was then a young assistant in the Department of Geophysics in the then Sorbonne University. And he remembered an early morning of a working day when the head of the department, senior professor, called for an urgent meeting and was extremely furious that two lenses from his microscope, which was kept in his office, disappeared. And he couldn't believe that someone could enter into his office and pick up those lenses without informing him about it. He was furious and said that if within 2 hours he would not learn who dare take the lenses from his microscope, then everybody in the department will be severely punished. Everybody was stunned, couldn't believe that something of this sort might have happened. And then the youngest member of the department raised timidly his hand and said, yes, Professor, I did take the lenses from your microscope, but that happened 5 years ago. The story says much about the senior professors and the young assistants in the departments. But the story also inspired me to address you the issue of the Romanian higher education landscape with reference to the academic performances. What counts as academic performance? What generates those academic performances? And how did we come at the stage in which academic performances are evaluated, collected, processed, evaluated, and then the outputs of this evaluation are used in order to reshape higher education systems and institutions. Since you may agree with me that since year 2000, mostly from this period, academic performances have held a key position in the reconfiguration of all higher education systems. What counts as academic performance may refer to the quality of graduates, learning resources made available to graduates, the types of beliefs the graduates acquire and then leave the university into the wider world, but also research productivity and services to the community. If we understand by academic performances these three clusters of outputs, of academic outputs, I put them in a rather random order. But if you go in any university, you may see that research productivity holds the key position. The other two are rather derived. Of course, academics would argue strongly about it, saying that the teaching, learning are the key to the existence of the university as an institution. But academics would not check on their teaching productivity as they would check on research productivity. And they evaluate in a collegiate way what publications you've done, where did you publish, how original your outputs are. But it's part of the hypocrisy of the academics. Is not the only one, but this is covered in wide discourses, well elaborated, some of them, but after spending so much time in universities, I know it very well. This is the key, this type of performances. The question is, why academic performances arrive at counting so much? How are they generated? Can we arrive at the stage in which to explain their production, their dissemination, and why we have so many alternative discourses associated with performances, and why academic performances became the object of private and public entrepreneurship, league tables, rankings, classifications, are private investors' territory mostly. No ministry would dare organize nationally, or indeed European Commission would not dream of making an European ranking of universities, though the initiative of multi-rank is well known to you. Now, after referring to a few general introductory remarks, I will refer to the Romanian higher education system in details. How can we explain the generation, the production of academic performances? First of all, history matters. You may well remember a saying which was put forward by a historian of higher education in Europe, who said that out of 52 organizations or institutions which haven't changed in the last 900 years, 49 are universities and 1 is the Parliament of the Isle of Man. So universities cope with history in a very special way. Circulation of elites, changes in ideologies and politics, changes in the economy, in culture, did occur, but without touching the university. If we look at the modern university, take Humboldtian University as the model, that is considered as being the modern type of university. We may see that since Humboldt proclaimed his model of university in the German state of the time, universities haven't changed. In fact, what you see is a strong mimetism in how the university world shaped itself, which led to a very strong isomorphic structure of higher education systems all over the world. There may be variation in certain aspects, but the key structures are the same. So history does matter, but in the sense that universities are not highly sensitive to how history passes. What happens is that academics do concentrate on their discipline, and the university is just an umbrella. Well, umbrella is there to defend one from storms, rain, shrinking of resources, you may say it. But the continent of any academic is the discipline, and within the discipline the subdiscipline, and within the subdiscipline, finally, is the point of view. So any professor identifies, if he's lucky, with a point of view. So university is a collection of viewpoints of academics, which are highly isolated from each other. If you enter into the department, the only common thing is the label, but within that you may see a variety of approaches. And so what counts as academic performance after all within that institution? Is the academic performance of one academic, and of course the egos, the academics' egos are similar to a baron who should have his mansion at the top of the hill, and everybody should look from the bottom of the hip at the baron. Despite certain publications regarding the production of knowledge nowadays, like for instance Gibbon, Novotny, who look at the radical changes in the production of knowledge and in the uses of knowledge today, university research, teaching goes the same traditional lines, as if we are in the 19th century, in the 20th century, or today. So when we talk about reforms, we should understand that history does matter. From this perspective, I would intend to invite you further, and then I will come to a view. If we take this rather skeptical view related to how history matters in the academic world, probably we end up by contemplating what is going on, and we let universities be as they are. Then there is another type of analysis, and this is related mostly to research on higher education. Variables and indicators are defined in such a way as anyone looking at OECD or UNESCO Institute of Statistics would discover a wide pool of indicators with data filled in. And then statistically, one starts combining, correlating, regressing indicators and arriving at, let's say, at a regression equation in which you say that that variable or that variable counts very much in the production of certain academic performance. Economists use this type of analysis very much, but also sociologists and higher education researchers do almost the same. But when looking at this type of analysis, focus on statistical analysis of variables and indicators, we discover a sort of endogeneity of the analytical tool, in the sense that you have a system and you look within that system how various parts of this system are combining or have been combined. And you say that this part determines or is the cause of this part. But the question is, can we expect from this endogenous analysis to identify which is the most powerful tool in generating performances or not? I'm not entering further into the details. The only thing I want to question is this: is there any exogenous factor which should determine a certain endogenous functioning of the system? This question is rather rhetorical. You know that academics are very familiar with saying that, in saying that politicians do not understand how universities function. and therefore they should be provided with resources, never enough, but should arrive at a sort of optimal allocation of public resources, and then should be left in peace to deal with their own business. That's one alternative. The other alternative is that the politicians would say that universities will never change from inside. They need outside pushes to change. If we take, for instance, Bologna process, that was a process which was initiated from outside. Politicians, Claude Allegri, whom I mentioned, brought the ministers, brought the governments together and say, well, we should launch such a change in order to make degrees in Europe comparable, compatible, and so on. And then new institutions have been brought in, which are the Bologna institutions. You all know which are those institutions. Quality assurance, reshaping of curricula, introduction of credit systems, and so on. These institutions were imposed on universities from the outside, though they were practiced for long periods of time in certain universities, outside and indeed inside Europe. What happened to them, I'm not going to enter into details. But if you take one example, for instance, how quality assurance functions, many academics will say that it's such a bureaucratic system which is irrelevant, highly irrelevant. Not only that it's highly bureaucratic, but also those evaluating quality are a sort of second-class academics. You will never, they would say, never meet an academic with high performances in research going to evaluate a research program. Would go into peer reviewing in science. That would be very pleased to do. But not in going and look, in order to look at. So this institution, which is one of the most important institutions brought by the Bologna process and raised at the level which is considered as being the cornerstone of how our system should function, the most productive in research academics would consider as being not as important as some would consider. So something which was brought from outside, inside, may have certain effects, which depends on how the system operates. So instead of considering these two alternatives, endogeneity of the system of the analysis or exogenous analysis, imposing on how the system functions inside itself, why don't we look at how institutions are shaped in higher education? Here, what I propose is a perspective which is borrowed from the economic analysis, which is called institutionalist analysis. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Well, what counts as an institution refers to the rules of the game. What is the legal basis? What is the what norms we take as reference? And this could be formal in terms of laws, but could be also informal. Peer reviewing has a sort of written rules there, but when I receive a paper for reviewing, I don't look at those. I practice it from the tradition of the academic world. And these are informal. And in Central Eastern Europe, but not only there, in most of Europe, laws on higher education were considered as being the key to the change of the system. Bologna process was brought in by promoting laws. In Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, very detailed laws, so a lot of institutions. But also if you look at France, at UK indeed, introducing legal institutions was considered to be the key. I finish with these introductions with certain questions. One, why academic performances arrive at playing the key role in shaping the institutions and systems of higher education? Second, is the top-down approach to reforming higher education, let's say from a legalistic perspective, promoting laws, the best approach? And then a final question, why institutions, academic institutions, traditionally instituted for hundreds of years, if not if we take only the modern university, for let's say 200 years, why are so resilient to change? Now, I would illustrate it with the Romanian higher education system. When we initiated this reform in 2010, we look at how higher education, Romanian higher education academic performances were distributed in comparison with those from other European countries. Firstly, with those from our region, Central Eastern European countries, and then from Western European countries. And we could realize that there are, in research, the research productivity by each academic was very low. There were academic stars in the universities with high productivity, but the great majority have a very low productivity. Moreover, this productivity was considered as being nationally relevant, while we get closer and closer to the European higher education area and then to the European Union. If you look at databases, international databases, very well known, yeah? And you see where Romanian research productivity is located and how this is distributed individually. And then how this is distributed institutionally, you would see huge differences. Let's say 3 universities in Romania would count for 90% of the research publications. So the rest do not count. However, all institutions, all higher education institutions, consider themselves as being teaching and research institutions. What is most important in each university is the research. But the research productivity was not there to count. The number of public institutions increased dramatically since 1990. In fact, it doubled the number of public institutions, and then the number of private universities mushroomed. And yet, within the public sector, almost the same amount of funds was distributed to a high number, and therefore, because any university is a teaching and research university, any academic was entitled to the same sort of privileges, opportunities, and so on, while you remember what I said, research productivity was so unevenly distributed that you cannot accept such a state. Secondly, it's not just this isomorphic development. I mean, the same mimetic structures in all universities, they existed, but also private universities brought about a very sort of continuous lowering of the prestige of higher education for various reasons. A private university arrived at about 200,000 students. Most of them enrolled in distance learning types of degrees. And this university accounted for about 50% of all public enrollments. And there was no quality, in fact, of education in such an institution. So this became intolerable. So radical measures had to be taken. Then the traditional funding of universities, which was initiated at the beginning of the 1990s, was based on the principle of equity and equality. Basically, that meant was that the student was the key, and resources were to be distributed by a sort of formula based on the equivalent student principle, no matter the performances. Then was added a quality principle in the public funding of universities, but that has an impact of about 5% of the overall fund, public purse allocated to universities. I'm not entering into details why this happened. I mean, to put it shortly, in an isomorphic system, no differences are acceptable because that would touch the institutional funding of the university. Then there were a lot of other developments, like multiple positions. I mean, someone would teach in a public, in another public, in one private, another private. So almost each academic had sort of multiple employment, but not only in the academic world, also outside the academic world. And all this had to be interrupted. We made an analysis, promoted a law, and then all of a sudden the crisis came about. And now the question is, should economic crisis, associated as it was with a social and political crisis, is a time of opportunity? You know the famous saying that the crisis in Greece, in Greek, means also opportunity, not just a sort of negative type of development. Is this an opportunity for bringing about changes in higher education, or is something else? In fact, the reform we brought about aim at a few principles. Let me mention some of them. One was that we have to strongly differentiate universities according to their academic performances. That meant, in fact, to classify universities in several clusters considered as being equivalent, but with different key performances, which were expected to be generated within the system. So we identify three clusters: research universities, teaching and research universities, and just teaching universities. And these classes were to be tied up to funding, in the sense that research universities would have receive funding also for research, not just for teaching, those in teaching and research should receive funds for teaching, but only in those disciplines in which the research productivity was high, and those for teaching, just for teaching. Do good. So it was a sort of mission-driven classification and performance-driven classification. We managed to make this exercise, and one mention I should make is that the classes of universities were not closed in two senses, in two respects. One was that a university, no matter which class would be, may have study programs or research programs which would locate them in a different ranking. And the university could evolve from one class to the other, or a study program could evolve from one rank to the other. So it was a lot of incentives were introduced in order to allow high flexibility in the system. So a research university could fall down while a teaching university could raise up. And we were very careful to do this. You may imagine that this was highly controversial. In fact, we had isomorphic universities. Each academic is highly performative. Each university is highly performative, and how can you expect that to belong to a certain class in which you should do just teaching? And why good quality teaching should count less than good quality research? Yeah? Why so? So there were a lot of incentives provided to good quality teaching, and there were no barriers in assuring flexibility. That was one thing. The second was that the funding, public funding of universities was to be dramatically changed, in the sense that there were basic funding, which was publicly assured on an equal basis for all universities, but that was the minimum basic funding. And then a whole range of funds, some for allowing student protection, how do you say it? Scholarships, hostels, that was separate. But then there were a special fund for providing opportunities for an institution to develop in a certain direction, and that was on a competitive basis. So a pool of money, and all universities would compete in order to evolve institutionally in a certain way. And therefore, the public funding on university was a differentiated funding, but tied up to certain performances which the university would like to reach. In addition, universities were encouraged to develop private venture capital sort of activities. They could initiate private companies, from foundation to productive service oriented companies, and run on a private basis on the market, being tied to the university but never affecting the core function of the university. But our academic entrepreneurs, they are academic entrepreneurs, which is so much different from being an economic entrepreneur. So there was no initiative, but in academic entrepreneurship. And academic entrepreneurship is of a different type. I can talk about it, I know, in this part of the world. is very different from economic entrepreneurship. There was no initiative in economic entrepreneurship in any university. And then we changed the type of governance. Let me give you an example which we wanted to promote. Initially, we proposed that the rector of the university should be internationally recruited by a search committee. And that was an outcry. As a good colleague of mine, who happens to be a former rector of one of the biggest universities in Romania and a grande politician, used to say that this is an attack against academic democracy. How can you suspend the right of an academic to vote for the Senate, for the dean, for the rector? How can you dare do that? The historical irony is that in her own university, the rector is not an academic nowadays. He's someone who has just some managerial skills of a special type of managerial skills. No other university opted for this alternative because we introduced the other alternative that the whole community should vote like in a referendum. So you have a candidate, that was very ironical, we wanted to put it forward in a very ironical way. So you have a pool of candidates, whoever want to be a rector, and then everybody would vote for, like in a referendum, you see, everybody goes to vote, any member of the community. Would you expect this to have such an appeal? But again, the irony, I mean, the whole thing was full of ironies. The irony was that all universities but one, where my colleague, my academic colleague, was the rector and protested strongly against it, preferred this full democracy referendum type of vote for the rector. I mean, universities are institutionally tied up to their history, and whatever amendments they may bring, the core is the same. So there is no difference between today university and 1 century ago university. I mean, variations, yes, they are, but the core is there. You cannot change it. And this is the irony also of the Bologna process. You brought a lot of institutions, but the core is the same. It didn't change. You add up flowers to the icon, but the saint is the same, not his symbolic nature has not been changed essentially. We also wanted students to play a key role in evaluating their teachers, in being very critical with the way lectures are presented and so on. Didn't have any effect. But it so happened that the crisis came, and also, so this law was promoted in 2011. But what happened after that? The crisis came, one. Second, elections of rectors came. Third, general elections in the country. So a new government came. 3 ingredients at the same time with something which wanted to change the system. Is a time of unpredictability. And now in the year 2012, and this year I'm waiting from the backyard to see what is going to come about again. What we contemplate is that some of the new institutions are on hold. For instance, funding. 2 governments, 2 years, 2 budgetary years, with 2 different governments, didn't touch the legal provisions regarding the public funding of universities. So the legal provisions are there, while the budgetary allocations are done according to the previous legislation. Don't ask me how that is possible, because the Ministry of Finance is responsible for that. Probably both, or the 3 ministers on the row could be made accountable for not implementing the legal provisions of the new law. But in a system, if you want to change something in higher education, I'm sorry to say, change the funding. If you change the funding, everything would rotate rapidly. I mean, don't expect that you change the basic institutions. That will never be changed. But the way these institutions would function, you may see certain adjustments, but the key institutions would remain the same. So, what messages I wanted to convey? One is that academic performances arrive at holding the key position in the shaping of higher education all over the world. Is the mushrooming of league tables, both at national, regional, and global level. The more they are contested, the more effective they become within universities. Anyhow, they were there permanently because academics have those big egos, and they count the performances when they discuss about the universities. For how long are we going to be with the evaluation of academic performances? I don't venture any prediction, but on the short term, universities are going to cope one way or the other with the references to academic performances. Second, top-down approaches to reforming higher education systems are totally irrelevant for 3 reasons. 1, history matters in higher education more than in any other system. Second, academic institutions, in those institutionalist terms, are very resilient. Higher education universities are the most conservative, and they preserve the institutional core, the institutional matrix, which is specific to them, and they just add, in a sort of Baroque way, flowers, birds, twittering endlessly, but the core is the same. You cannot change, you cannot touch that. It's just the illusion of higher education specialists and sometimes of politicians that we can touch the core. Unfortunately, after so long being related to higher education, I'm rather skeptical of this. Depends what sort of twittering you dream of, so that you can better, you may introduce certain tunes, harmonies in the system in order to generate certain performances than the other. However, there is one thing which may be the locomotive of change, and this is the funding of higher education. If you touch that, academics are very sensitive. Not that they are very greedy compared with other people in society, but because they aim very highly in terms of academic research, and they need enough funds to invest in research. And research is one of the most expensive business nowadays. And if you are not competitive in research, your chances of being dependent on those who are highly competitive in research and innovation. Thirdly, we live through periods of high unpredictability. That means that various routes are open to us. And we cannot bet which route would lead you in a shorter while to Rome, which is bumpier than the other route. Unpredictable times are very interesting. You know the Chinese curse. And we have to cope with interesting, unpredictable times. The roots of unpredictability are very deep in the soil. If I look at my country, political unpredictability is very high. If I look at Europe as a whole, political unpredictability is very high. Economic unpredictability is very high. Yeah? I just read, before arriving in Budapest, Rubini's forecast about the economy. If you look at him, he has very gloomy predictions. But if you look at Brussels' predictions, and if you look at my government predictions, you have an altogether different. So let's face various routes. Don't take just one. It may prove to be very bumpy. See bridges between. I'm building up bridges now between various routes. One final word. I look at, nowadays, I'm very interested to discover how one may explain economic performances of my country. And I look at Hungary's account for and some other Eastern European countries at these performances. This is a fascinating story, fascinating. Why Industrial Revolution came about in Britain and not elsewhere? Why the Emperor of Austro-Hungarian Empire refused to give permission to the construction of a railway in the empire? I mean, what he said is absolutely fascinating. He said, why my subjects should move so fast from one place to the other? They are used to travel at a slow pace, and we should not encourage people to travel faster from one place to the other because they may have some other dreams. Yeah? So, Austro-Hungarian Empire was not the most industrialized empire, and history proved to happen so when compared with other countries around. And it's fascinating to look at this and what chances Europe may have in arriving at high economic performances. And higher education is part of this wider system, is never isolated. Everything resonates within higher education. probably in a sort of very noisy way. So that was what I wanted to tell you. Those interested in certain details may have access at this PowerPoint, but I always have the impression that the PowerPoint presentation is keeping me too tight to something which already castrated my mind. And being with you, I prefer to be at least today without being tied up to the text. But it's distributed and I'm ready to answer by email any of your questions. Thank you.
So